Thomas Kearney was a lighthouse keeper on the northern coast of Scotland, stationed at a remote facility that marked the boundary between navigable waters and the treacherous shoals that had claimed 17 vessels in the past century. He was a practical man, the kind who kept meticulous records of weather patterns and tidal movements, who performed his duties with mechanical precision and spent his evenings reading technical manuals about maritime navigation. He had no use for superstition, no patience for the old stories that fishermen told in village pubs about things that lived in the deep water beyond the reach of nets and sonar. Until the night he found her on the rocks below his station, injured and shivering, her skin reflecting the beam of his lighthouse in ways that human skin should not, with eyes that held depths no human gaze could contain. She told him her name was Mira, and when he asked where she came from, she gestured toward the ocean with a vague movement that could have meant a nearby village or somewhere infinitely farther. She had wounds on her legs, deep gashes that looked like they came from coral or rocks, and she limped when she walked, favoring her right side in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar to her, as if walking itself was a skill recently acquired. Thomas brought her inside, against every regulation that governed his isolated post, and tended to her injuries with the first aid supplies kept for emergencies. Her body temperature was several degrees lower than it should have been, her pulse barely detectable, even when he pressed his fingers firmly against her wrist. She spoke English with an accent he could not place, words that formed correctly, but with a rhythm that belonged to some other language, some other way of constructing meaning through sound. She stayed. Not because he asked her to, but because she seemed to have nowhere else to go, or perhaps because she had decided that this was where she needed to be, for reasons Thomas could not begin to understand. Days became weeks, and Thomas found himself drawn to her in ways that defied the careful logic he had built his life around. She moved through his small quarters with an otherworldly grace, never quite comfortable on dry land, but adapting with each passing day. She told him fragments of stories about her life before, about communities that lived in places humans could not reach, about families bound by ties that had nothing to do with blood or law. She never explained why she had left, why she had come to shore, why she accepted his presence with a calm that suggested she had been expecting him, or someone like him, all along. They married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at the village registry office 20 miles down the coast. The registrar was an elderly woman who had processed thousands of marriages over her long career, and she barely looked up from her paperwork as Thomas and Mira signed the documents that would legally bind them. If she noticed anything unusual about Mira, about the way her skin seemed to hold moisture even in the dry office air, about the faint smell of salt and deep ocean that clung to her despite multiple showers, about the way her pupils dilated in response to the fluorescent lights as if they were accustomed to functioning in near-total darkness, she said nothing. The marriage certificate was filed, stamped, archived in dusty records that would gather dust until some distant day when someone might have reason to search for them. Mira became pregnant 4 months after the wedding, though she told Thomas long before any test could confirm it, told him with a certainty that came from some internal knowing that had nothing to do with missed cycles or morning sickness. She carried the child with an ease that seemed impossible, never experiencing the discomforts that pregnancy typically brought, never showing fatigue or pain. Her body adapted to pregnancy as if it had been designed for this specific purpose, as if creating life was a function as natural to her as breathing was to Thomas. She would spend hours standing at the window of the lighthouse, staring at the ocean that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and Thomas would watch her and wonder what she was seeing, what she was thinking, whether some part of her longed to return to whatever place she had come from. The birth happened on a night when the sea was unusually calm, when the waves barely moved and the water looked like black glass reflecting a moonless sky. Mira went into labor without warning, without the gradual progression that medical texts described. One moment she was standing at the window, the next she was on the floor, her body moving through contractions with a rhythm that seemed choreographed rather than involuntary. Thomas called for an ambulance, but she refused to let him, grabbed his wrist with strength that bordered on painful, and told him no hospitals, no doctors, no records. She told him the child would be born here, in this place between land and sea, and that was how it had to be. So Thomas delivered his own son in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, following instincts he did not know he possessed, cutting the umbilical cord with hands that shook from adrenaline and wonder. The boy was beautiful in a way that transcended normal human beauty, with Mira's eyes and Thomas's dark hair, with skin that seemed to shimmer in certain lights and fingers that were slightly webbed between the knuckles, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. They named him Callum, a name that meant dove, a name that spoke of peace and freedom and the space between sky and water. Thomas held his son and felt a love so overwhelming it frightened him, a protective instinct that made him understand for the first time why fathers throughout history had done terrible things to keep their children safe. And Mira held the baby and sang to him in a language Thomas had never heard, sounds that were part melody and part something else, vibrations that seemed to resonate in Thomas's chest and make his heart beat in synchronization with rhythms older than human civilization. They tried to register the birth because even Thomas's love for Mira could not completely override his respect for law and proper documentation. They went to the same registry office where they had been married, and the same elderly registrar processed the paperwork with the same indifferent efficiency. Father's name, Thomas Kearney. Child's name, Callum Kearney. Date of birth, location of birth, all recorded correctly. Mother's name, and here the registrar paused, looked at Mira with an expression that might have been confusion or recognition or something between the two. She typed something into her computer, frowned, typed again, then reached for a rubber stamp that Thomas had not seen her use for any other document. She stamped the birth certificate with red ink that looked almost black in the office lighting, and when Thomas looked at what she had stamped, he saw two words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mother. Unknown. Mira did not react to the stamp, did not protest or demand correction. She simply signed where indicated and walked out of the office with Callum in her arms, leaving Thomas to gather the documents and follow her into the grey Scottish afternoon. He asked her later why she had not objected, why she had accepted a designation that was objectively false, and she told him that some truths could not be captured in human documents, that the registrar had marked what she could see rather than what existed, and that this was mercy rather than error. Thomas did not understand what she meant, but he filed the birth certificate with their other important papers and tried not to think about the implications of those two stamped words. Callum grew faster than human children should grow, not dramatically but noticeably, his development accelerated by percentages that would concern pediatricians if Thomas had allowed any pediatricians to examine him. By 6 months he was walking. By a year he was speaking in complete sentences, switching effortlessly between English and the strange language Mira used when they were alone. He loved the ocean with an intensity that went beyond normal childhood fascination, would spend hours watching the waves from the lighthouse windows, would cry inconsolably on days when storms made it impossible to go outside and feel the salt spray on his face. Mira would take him to the edge of the water when Thomas was occupied with his duties, would wade in with Callum in her arms, going deeper than was safe, staying under longer than should be possible. And when they emerged, both of them would be smiling in ways that made Thomas feel like an outsider, like a visitor to his own family. If you have ever felt this sense of loving someone completely while knowing that some essential part of them exists in a place you cannot follow, a place you will never be invited to enter, share your story in the comments below. Because what happened next in Thomas's life suggests that there are bonds that transcend the connections we understand, that there are claims on our children that predate their birth and persist regardless of law or love or any human understanding of family. Callum turned 3 on a night when the sea was rough, when waves crashed against the rocks with violence that shook the lighthouse foundation and made the beam flicker despite backup systems designed to keep it steady. Thomas was performing his nightly checks, ensuring that all equipment functioned properly, that no ships would be led astray by malfunction or darkness. Mira and Callum were supposed to be asleep in their quarters, but when Thomas finished his rounds and returned to check on them, he found the rooms empty, the door open, a trail of wet footprints leading from the bedroom to the exterior stairs that descended to the rocks below. He ran, faster than he had ever run, taking the metal stairs 3 at a time despite the rain that made every surface treacherous, calling their names into the storm that swallowed his voice and threw it back at him as meaningless sound. He reached the bottom of the stairs and saw them at the water's edge, Mira standing waist-deep in the violent surf, holding Callum against her chest. She was facing the ocean, her body braced against waves that would have knocked Thomas off his feet, and she was singing that same strange song she had sung when Callum was born, louder now, competing with the storm, calling to something that waited in the deeper water beyond the reach of lighthouse beam and human understanding. Thomas waded in, screaming at her to come back, to bring their son to safety, to stop whatever she was doing. She turned to look at him, and in the intermittent illumination provided by the lighthouse, he saw that her eyes had changed. The pupils expanded to cover almost all of the iris, adapted to see in darkness that no human eye could penetrate. She looked at him with something that might have been love, or might have been pity, or might have been both, and she spoke words that the storm carried to him with perfect clarity, despite the impossible acoustics. She told him that Callum was not entirely his, that their son belonged to 2 worlds and could not remain in only one, that there were others who had been waiting for him since before he was conceived, waiting to take him to places where he could become what he was meant to be, rather than remaining a strange child in a human world that would never fully accept him. Thomas tried to reach them, but the water had become something else, had become an active force that pushed him back, that generated currents specifically designed to prevent his approach. He watched, helpless and drowning in shallow water, as Mira waded deeper, as Callum stopped being a frightened child and became something else, his body relaxing into the waves with recognition, with homecoming, with the relief of finally being in an environment his physiology was designed for. And then they went under, not sinking but diving, purposeful and controlled, and they did not resurface. Thomas searched for hours, called Coast Guard and police and anyone who might help, provided descriptions and timelines and all the logical information that humans use to make sense of tragedy, but the ocean kept his wife and son, gave back neither bodies nor explanations, left only absence where family had existed. The investigation concluded accidental drowning, double tragedy, evidence consistent with a mother who became disoriented in the storm and took her child into dangerous water, unable to fight the currents that pulled them under. Thomas did not correct this narrative, did not share the details that would transform tragedy into something else, something that would mark him as unreliable or insane. He kept working at the lighthouse, performing his duties with mechanical precision, maintaining the light that warned ships away from the rocks where his family had disappeared. And sometimes, on very calm nights, when the water was still and the moon illuminated the surface like silver glass, he would see shapes moving in the deeper water, shapes that were too large and too purposeful to be seals or dolphins or any catalogued marine life. And once, just once, he saw a small face break the surface, a child's face with eyes that reflected the lighthouse beam in ways human eyes should not, eyes that looked at him with recognition before disappearing back into the depths that had claimed him. If this account disturbs you, if it makes you question what lies beneath the surface of the ocean that covers most of our world, then you need to keep this channel alive. Subscribe. Share these testimonies. Because the suppression of these encounters is not conspiracy but comfort, the human preference to believe that we understand our world and that the boundaries we have drawn around reality are accurate rather than arbitrary. The ocean is not empty water waiting to be explored. It is territory occupied by intelligences that predate human civilization, by creatures that have their own laws and their own claims on those who carry their blood. And Thomas Kearney's son was claimed according to rules that human courts and birth certificates cannot acknowledge or affect. Stay warned about what really lives beneath the surface, because that warning may be the only protection you have if you ever find yourself at the border between human world and something else. If you ever meet someone whose eyes hold depths you cannot fathom, if you ever create life with someone who belongs to waters you cannot enter. Thomas never remarried, never had other children, never left the lighthouse that stood at the boundary between his world and the world that had taken his family. He grew old, performing duties that seemed increasingly meaningless, warning ships away from dangers that were geological when the real dangers were biological, were cognitive, were entities that chose when to reveal themselves and when to remain hidden in waters too deep for human technology to fully penetrate. He kept the birth certificate with its red stamp designation, Mother Unknown, and understood too late what the elderly registrar had seen, what she had been trained or cursed to recognize, what she had marked as accurately as her limited human framework allowed. Some mothers are unknown not because records are incomplete, but because they come from places that records were never designed to acknowledge, from depths where human law dissolves like salt in infinite water. Thomas died at his post, alone, found by the relief keeper who arrived to start the next shift. The lighthouse continued to function, continues to function still, maintained by keepers who know nothing of the man who lost his family to the ocean that their light illuminates. But those who have worked there report strange phenomena that official logs do not record, sounds that rise from the water on calm nights, songs in languages that should not exist, calls that make hearts beat in rhythms they were not designed to follow. And occasionally, on nights when the sea is particularly still, the lighthouse beam catches something in the water below, a shape that might be a large fish or a small human, a child who swims with impossible grace through water that should crush lungs and stop hearts, a child who looks up at the light his father maintained and then disappears into darkness absolute, leaving only questions that have no answers and a birth certificate stamped with truth disguised as bureaucratic error. Mother, unknown, because some truths cannot be documented, can only be experienced and endured and carried until death releases you from the burden of knowledge that no one will believe, that no system can accommodate, that exists in the spaces between scientific certainty and myth, proven real through loss, that leaves evidence only in hearts that will never heal, and lights that continue to burn long after those who tended them have returned to darkness.